is Jewish intellectual assimilation, and one speaker is missing, Cherniss, and Vladimir will briefly describe his work and his project in the end of our panel to make up for this absence. But otherwise, we have two wonderful scholars from Bucureşti University, and we begin our panel with the presentation by Marius, who now is postdoc at the Bucureşti University, and who together with Vladimir wrote several books and also served as an editor of the journal called History of Communism in Europe. And the title of his presentation is Death Between Public and Private Spheres. The floor is yours.
So thanks, Elena, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me cut to the chase and start by saying that Stefan Zweig's suicide in February 1942 occurred after an intermission of a few years between life and death, memory and trauma. The torments and despondency of a self-imposed exile, especially his Brazilian finale, are basically the background against which Zweig created his heart-rending memoir, The World of Yesterday. So in this context, I think revisiting one of Hanna Arendt's most interesting arguments from her enthusiastic review of Hermann Broch's 1945 novel, The Death of Virgil, to her blistering account of the world of yesterday, and from a period, and from portrait of a period and we refugees to the moral of history, is indicative, I believe, of her critique of any apolitical Bildung and the lack of action-oriented thinking. So while she never concealed a feeling of revulsion aroused by any metropolis of ethical vacuum, I'm using her words, be it Weimar Germany or Vienna of the same period, Arendt's quarrel with the world of yesterday, I think, is much more than, let's say, Hermann Broch's manifest anti-elitism. So what Arendt basically criticizes in Zweig's Weltanschauung is basically the fact that he chooses to remain utopian in the midst of apocalypse. As for today, I will try to broaden the understanding of what she once memorably called the abyss of empty space between the no longer and not yet, as well as to explain her rather intriguing reaction to the tragic death of this different Virgil, one of the major luminaries, as you all know, of cosmopolitanism. So where Hanna Arendt drew life and engagement out of the condition we call exile, Stefan Zweig felt desperate, despondent, and eventually succumbed to this fatal depression. Let me start with a personal confession. One of my favorite books is Man in Dark Times. I read it many times, and I was puzzled by certain absences, so to speak. Among them, one of the most striking is the lack of a Zweig chapter. That Arendt included her Broch and even her Brecht essay was not contingent. Explicitly biographical and implicitly autobiographical, each text is as much about the discussed author as about Arendt herself. Now, going back to her review on Zweig's last book, on Zweig's memoir, written and published in 1943, Arendt's text, titled Stefan Zweig, Jews in the World of Yesterday, is more than a book review. In fact, it is her critical approach to a whole philosophical perspective on political engagement, disengagement, vita activa versus vita contemplativa, partisanship versus detachment. It is clear in this text, I think, as in so many others, that Arendt disapproved of the, like the French say, au-dessous de la mêlée, above the maelstrom philosophy championed by Zweig in the footsteps of his friend, the French writer Romain Rolland. Of course, unlike Rolland, who had become a pro-Soviet fellow traveler, Zweig maintained a critical distance from the Stalinist totalitarian experiment. Yet, he preferred to keep silence regarding the Great Terror. In 1936, at the Buenos Aires Pen Congress, Zweig refused to join Emil Ludwig, among others, in publicly and unequivocally condemning the Nazi persecution of major intellectuals, including himself. So for someone like Hanna Arendt, who had been fully immersed in organizing support for Jewish emigration to the Palestine and other places, such withdrawal from the public sphere amounted, one may assume, to a moral debacle. In other words, her reading of Zweig, both his literature and his biography, indicate a strong disagreement with the novelist's misplaced and misleading, in her view, impotent pacifism. Hanna Arendt never embraced the transnational vision of a European cultural homeland. She was a German philosopher who experienced directly the advent of the catastrophe. So when she discusses Zweig's self-inflicted departure from this world, Arendt links it to a psychological trauma defined by the writer's failure to come to terms with what she designates as disgrace. Her main criticism, which most likely would not have applied to Zweig's close friend Joseph Roth, is that the author of The World of Yesterday was unable to grasp the earth-shattering effects of the Nazi revolution. For her, the duty and the responsibility of the intellectual in such appallingly dark times were to take sides. In other words, Arendt took issue with a certain political blindness rooted in moral ideals that had lost any genuine meaning under the dramatically changed circumstances. It allowed me to quote a bit from the Jewish writings. She says, like so many of his less sensible, less talented, and less endangered colleagues, he failed to perceive that the dignified restraint which society had so long considered a criterion of true Bildung was under such circumstances tantamount to plain cowardice in public life. End of quote. At this point, I would like to emphasize that Zweig's stance, which eventually led to the joint suicide in Petrópolis, Brazil, had as a clear precedent the fate of his dear friend Joseph Roth, who committed suicide in Paris on May 27, 1939. In turn, Roth's decision to put an end to his life was the consequence of him learning about the German writer Ernst Toller's hanging himself in New York on May 22, 1939. So one might argue that these two suicides plus Walter Benjamin's similar death 16 months later in September 26, 1940, did clearly shock and disturb Zweig. His whole world appeared disjoint, absurdly abolished, and inexorably hopeless. In spite of the fact that he received British citizenship, a status of which most of the Central European refugees could not even dream of, Zweig felt displaced, uprooted, and sentenced to live in a world devoid of all the ideals he had cherished and endorsed. So non-violence was replaced by the cult of violence, cosmopolitanism by tribal nationalism, humanitarian compassion was replaced by naked selfishness, bourgeois individualism by plebeian massification, modern sensibility by race and class intolerance. Now later, in 1951, in The Origins, Hanna Arendt would write about totalitarianism as the dissolution of two important dimensions. One was the annihilation of the moral and the legal person. At the moment of her Zweig review, she was still looking for an explanation. I'm trying to put everything into some context. Or better said, explanations to the absolute novelty of totalitarianism. So what she conceptualized later was perhaps Zweig's intuition, and the writer should perhaps have been treated more leniently in the light of the unprecedented nature of the totalitarian threat. After all, Zweig was not the only writer to give up resistance in the face of barbarism and its repercussions. At the moment of his suicide, one of the influential German exiles who took a significantly different stand was Klaus Monson, Thomas Mann's son. As a matter of fact, the year of his own suicide, the author of the novel Mephisto, in his last essay, titled Europe's Search for a New Credo, translated posthumously from German into English by his sister Erika, he voiced a pessimism clearly reminiscent of Roth, Zweig, and Benjamin. And allow me to quote from Mann. I'd like to see hundreds, indeed thousands of intellectuals follow the examples of Virginia Woolf, Ernst Toller, Stefan Zweig, Jan Masaryk. A suicide wave among the world's most distinguished, most celebrated minds of Europe would shock the peoples of their lethargy, would make them realize the extreme gravity of the ordeal man has brought on upon himself by his folly and selfishness. End of quote. So, if we think of the current conditions in Europe and the refugee crisis, it is obvious that Arendt was right in identifying humiliation as unbearably embarrassing. The refugees of our days, of course, do not experience any nostalgia for a vanished world, the way Zweig, let's say, Franz Werfel, Elias Canetti, and so many others did in idealizing what Hannah Arendt called the gilded trellises of a peculiar sanctuary. Yet they symbolize the same fragility, vulnerability, and anguish generated by the complete disappearance of state protection and the transformation into objects of bureaucratic benevolence or rejection. So what the famous director Wes Anderson captured in his Grand Budapest Hotel film is precisely the disappearance of both bourgeois transgressions and taboos, etiquette and its opposite, artistic irreverence. Whatever the world of yesterday was, and one cannot forget that the counterpart of to Wittgenstein's Vienna was Hitler's Vienna, there was a yearning for a supranational community of spirits. Reading Zweig's autobiography, one is struck by his lack of interest in German philosophical disquisitions, and on the contrary, by his interest in people such as Sigmund Freud, Thomas Mann, or Rilke. Let's talk a bit about the dark times. These were the times when the whole Enlightenment project was under siege. A major French political thinker, Elie Halevi, delivered a lecture with a telltale title, L'ère de tyrannie, The Age of Tyrannies, in 1936. So humanist intellectuals found themselves caught between the scylla of anti-fascist revolutionary engagements and the Charybdis of self-destructive resignation. Many of these cultural figures were cosmopolitan Jews unable to and unwilling to renounce their dream of achieving Immanuel Kant's eternal peace ideal. One of them was Stefan Zweig, like I said, who witnessed in fear and desolation the sinking of the Universalist European boat. For him, it was not that Europe was killed, but rather that it allowed the neo-barbarians to take over and destroy any sense of solidarity and empathy. So Grand Budapest Hotel is therefore a metaphor for a Grand Abyss Hotel. And the emphasis is here on the word hotel, which stems from the Latin hospitale, which means guest house. So the Nazi cataclysm, to quote the title of Dan Dinner's excellent book, was precisely the abolishment of any opening towards hospitality. The Jew became, in this resentful cosmology, the very embodiment of the alien vermin that the defenders of the pure racial community needed to get rid of. So all the guarantees for the Jewish dignified survival in Europe were systematically suppressed. Millions of people found themselves deprived of their civic rights to the point of turning into dispensable populace or mere numbers. This was the suffocatingly somber universe that made Zweig realize what he experienced as the irreversibility of the catastrophe. So in order to fight, one needs to envision a possibly difficult but still achievable goal. For Zweig, much more than for Hannah Arendt and Thomas Mann, what had happened appeared as a one-way fatality. And I will continue with a quote from the world of yesterday. Zweig says, "Today, as a writer I am, in Grillparzer's words, one who living follows his own corpse. Everything or almost everything that represents my work in the world during 40 years has been destroyed by one and the same fist. So if I allude to my success, I do not refer to something that belongs to me, but something that formerly was mine, like my house, my home, my security, my freedom, my ease of manner. I could not adequately describe the fall into the abyss, which I, with countless others equally innocent, suffered, if I did not indicate the height from which it occurred, and the singularity and consequences of this destruction of our whole literary generation and occurrence unique in history." End of quote. Therefore, unlike his friend Joseph Roth, Stefan Zweig did not identify himself with the Jewish tradition. As a matter of fact, one might think when Arendt wrote later about the pitfalls of assimilationism, she may have thought of someone like him, a literary giant, universally worshipped, invited into the Grand Salon, friends with countless celebrities, and more than secure financially. All these turned out to be an illusion, and the death of this illusion amounted for Zweig to the end of his world. So no need, I think, to demonstrate here that this was neither Hannah Arendt's nor Walter Benjamin's final gesture, Walter Benjamin's existential mode. This may be the explanation for Arendt's compassionate treatment of Benjamin's final gesture versus her unsparing criticism of Zweig's suicide. Ironically, she absorbed Zweig's interpretation of the Jewish tragedy in the 20th century. The same Zweig says in The World of Yesterday, those who suffered, it knew that it was pointless and they were guiltless. Their forefathers and ancestors of medieval times had at least known what they suffered for their belief, for their law. They had still possessed the talisman of the soul which today's generation had long since lost the inviolable faith in their God. They lived and suffered in the proud delusion that they were selected by the Creator as a people chosen for a special destiny. As long as their religion bound them together, they still were a community and therefore a power. So it is amazing, I think, how close the reading of the Jewish destiny appears in the above quoted paragraph and in various of Hannah Arendt's writings on these topics. One illustration may be helpful. Both Zweig and Arendt were puzzled by the explosion of anti-Semitism in countries like Austria and Germany, where the Jewish populations had long since melted into the dominant culture, and very frequently with tremendous contributions. Neither Austrian nor German Jews were externally recognizable, and clearly they were not a nation within a nation. So for both Zweig and Arendt, there was no Jewish question in this sense in Germany in 1933. And they both strove to understand how and why in Germany, of all places, anti-Semitic slogans held such promise of success, and why of all places it was possible in Germany to remove Jews totally from the life of the German nation. Arendt's main reproach to Zweig was that he chose an escapist position at the moment when he, of all people, precisely because he symbolized values worth fighting and dying for, could and should have been an active participant in a struggle in which good and evil were clearly separated. This may have been also the reason for Thomas Mann's severe judgment on the same topic, who considered, let's say, Zweig's suicide an act of cowardice. 75 years after the event, I believe that one needs to reconsider the pros and the cons. In 1943, when she wrote the review, Hannah Arendt had not attained her stellar prestige that was to come after the publication of The Origins of Totalitarianism. She was, of course, German Jewish, which meant something quite different from Austrian Jewish, or even more revealingly, Viennese Jewish. As for Thomas Mann, his main concern was the onslaught on German humanist culture, on reason, and less the fate of the German Jewish synthesis. Certainly, he was repelled by the Nazi atrocities and despised any form of racism, but his explanatory effort, in a way, was first and foremost a meditation on the Faustic avatars of the German culture that culminated in the Nazi barbarism. Now, instead of a few conclusions, preparing my paper for this conference, I reread Joseph Roth's The Wandering Jews. And I quote here again the last paragraphs of the afterword, written 80 years ago in June 1937. He says, "At this point, I should like to refer to the grimmest development in recent years. I mean, of course, the Spanish Civil War. A minority of readers will be aware of the version of the story according to which the Kerem, the rabbinical curse that was laid on Spain following its eviction of the Jews, is presently about to lapse. I am, of course, not claiming any explicit connection between the metaphysical curse and the grim reality, but I trust I may be permitted to draw the reader's attention to the facts. I don't want to be misunderstood as saying, just as the curse is wearing off, Spain is experiencing the greatest catastrophe in its history. I want only to point out the certainly more than curious coincidence of timing, and to quote the sentence of the fathers that goes, "The court of the Lord is in continuous session here on earth and in the hereafter. Centuries may pass, but the judgment is ineluctable." End of quote. So for Roth, like for Arthur Koestler or Simone Weil, the Spanish passions were symbolic cradle for the European or even global civil war. In this conflagration, what was at stake amounted to the fate of the oppressed, of the minorities, of the outcasts. After all, it was because of the solidarity with the underdog that George Orwell joined the anti-Stalinist and anti-fascist militias during the Spanish Civil War. None of the authors discussed in my intervention was prepared for the torments, trials, and ordeals that followed Hitler's coming to power. They had all internalized the cultural matrix which regarded the individual as the denizen of a moral world. Like the fictional Monsieur Gustave in Wes Anderson's film, they belonged to a beleaguered international brotherhood of hotel concierges. When the thugs attacked their Lebenswelt and turned them into unprotected and persecuted beggars for passports, they realized how right Sigmund Freud had been when he wrote about the thinness of our civilization's veneer. Stefan Zweig was an extremely retractile individual who understood better than most of his peers the deep mysteries of human neurosis. However, he was not prepared to cope with genocidal political paranoia. This was not cowardice, in my opinion, but a rejection, a refutation, a rebuttal of a world that had lost its humane meaning and understanding. So by taking his own life, Zweig bid farewell to all the things he had held dear to his heart. He could not reinvent a republic of letters annihilated by the avalanche of hatred, resentment, and ideological hysteria. Neither could he foresee any decent future or any future whatsoever for the Jewish people. In this respect, I don't think that Zweig would have objected to these words from Hanna Arendt, from We Refugees. The Committee of European Peoples went to pieces, and because it allowed its weakest member to be excluded and persecuted. End of quote. Now, reflecting on Klaus Monson's literary and political testament mentioned before, it is interesting to notice that he includes on the list of landmark suicides, in addition to Ernst Toller, Stefan Zweig, Virginia Woolf, and so on, the name of Jan Masaryk. When the Masaryk committed suicide was killed by the Soviet-controlled Czechoslovak secret police, it is significant that the name appears here together with Zweig and Toller, whose deaths were directly linked to the Nazi totalitarianism. 1 year after Klaus Mann committed suicide, the Congress for Cultural Freedom came into being at the initiative of Arthur Koestler, who, by the way, was to commit suicide himself in London, but later in early 80s. Stefan Zweig visited the Soviet Union in 1928. At the end of that 2-week trip, during which he had been lionized by the Soviet hosts, Zweig found in his pocket an anonymous letter, probably from a Soviet student. And this episode is clearly mentioned in the world of yesterday. He says, "Don't believe everything one tells you," this unknown said. "Don't forget that with all that they show you, there is much that is not shown you. Remember that most of the people who talk to you do not say what they wish to say, but only what they may tell you. We all are watched, and you yourself no less. Your interpreter reports every word, your telephone is taped, every step is observed." End of quote. Then what happened? In 1942, in a suburb of Rio de Janeiro, a brilliant, a brilliant Austrian Jewish intellectual and his wife poisoned themselves because they saw no reason to stay alive in a world controlled either by Hitler or by Stalin. Had he not died in 1942, I think he would have joined the Congress in company with Koestler, Stephen Spender, Czeslaw Milosz, and Karl Jaspers, Hannah Arendt's mentor. My paper has addressed a critical moment in the history of the European exile during the times of the Shoah, and the problem of intellectual responsibility in an epoch that Dan Diener rightly defined as a time of cataclysms, and Robert Gelately as the age of social catastrophe. Forced to leave a continent run amok where all the traditions they had cherished were trampled, disparaged, and practically annihilated, humanist thinkers, be they writers, poets, playwrights, sociologists, historians, philosophers, film directors, and so on, had to cope with a totally unprecedented situation. For Stefan Zweig, there was no light at the end of the tunnel, and his suicide was a testimony to this hopelessness. The Frankfurt School theorists, Adorno, Horkheimer, Lowenthal, Marcuse, acknowledged the tragic moment, mourned the death by suicide of the man whom they all regarded as a genius, Walter Benjamin, I'm talking about him, and yet continued to work for the defense of the reason against all odds. Hanna Arendt lamented, of course, Zweig's death, but she never accepted that suicide was more than a form of escape from what appeared to be an insoluble dilemma. So this may be the reason why she did not include the essay on Zweig in her Man in Dark Times. That's my supposition. She admired Rosa Luxemburg because of what she perceived as being the unity between thought and action. In her view, Zweig's suicide was the opposite of such a heroic stand. Vielen Dank.
The other speaker we have today is Vladimir, who is a professor of politics at the University of Maryland, and who is the author of numerous books and articles on history of Rhodes, communism, political ideologies, and revolutions of 1989. And as we spoke before this panel started, I was pleased to hear from these two speakers we have today that they now are finishing the book on the Truth Commission, and it's going to be a very unusual book because not only they describe the history of the Romanian Truth Commission, but they're going to come up with quite instrumental advice, if you wish, how to create Truth Commission in those East European countries that failed to do so so far. So please, Vladimir, how is yours?
Okay, I'll try to be rather brief. So at 3:05 I should finish. Okay, so Elena kindly mentioned here that Marius and I tried to complete a book for Cambridge, and it's called Democracy, Memory and Justice. Democracy, Memory and Justice, Romania Confronts Its Communist Past. I would not have mentioned this had it not been linked to the topic of the conference, and I'll insist a little bit on that. I served as chair of the Presidential Commission for the Analysis of the Communist Dictatorship in Romania in 2006, which led the then president of the country, the only case in a post-communist country where this happened, Traian Băsescu, to speak in front of the Romanian parliament and condemn the communist regime for its 45 years of existence as illegitimate and criminal. The inspiration, the philosophical inspiration, speak of Hanna Arendt's vision of the unity between theory and practice, which is basically the backbone of her political philosophy. Okay, so there's, I quote from memory, whenever action and thought are separated, the space of freedom is in danger. It's a very famous position, and this is basically the pillar of Arendt's philosophy, political philosophy, in my view. Okay, so we were inspired. We were meaning 17 people who were members of the commission who had to leave the commission, which was basically for three, because they were exposed as former secret police informers, and including the then vice rector of the Central European University. Okay, and this was a perfect reflection of the number of informers in the country under the communist dictatorship, about basically between 10 and 15%. Okay, so we lost 3 of our 19 members, so basically it's more or less the same. Okay, so the philosophical inspiration for us was very much Arendt. Actually, the theoretical chapter, the beginning, it refers to her vision of totalitarianism. Unabashedly, like most of my Central European friends, and I'll go into that, unabashedly we stick, and we will stick to the moral component of the totalitarian model. I'm a political scientist. I was very close to Zbigniew Brzezinski. As a matter of fact, he gave the endorsement on the cover of my book on the history of Romanian communism and so on. And I talked a lot to Brzezinski about that. Of course, the model needed to be updated. Of course, Hanna Arendt was aware of certain things. That the final words of the On Revolution about the Hungarian Revolution are a refutation of the idea of the inamovability, the frozen nature of the totalitarian system. Of course, these were clear. But as nice way of putting, as the distinguished emerita Hanna Arendt professor of political philosophy at the New School for Social Research, my dear friend Agnes Scherer, pointed out the other night in a conversation. I asked Agnes, what were, after all, if she didn't say it here, I'll bring it up. Okay, what would be the three, I said, loyal to the Trinitarian model, okay, and she said more than three. What would be the three most important contributions that you would recognize, acknowledge as Hanna Arendt's enduring legacy? And she summarized, and you have them there on your tape recorder. Okay, so the first would be the novelty of the totalitarian model. This was, after all, we had a very good presentation today on the Arendt, what's his name, the historian of the Holocaust. Raoul Hilberg. Okay, so the Hilberg. Okay, anybody who saw the movie by Claude Lanzmann, Shoah, Hilberg was the advisor to the movie, and he appears a lot in the movie Shoah. That if you spend 6.5 hours, and I did it 3 or 4 times, okay, then you see Hilberg speaking, and for Hilberg this was the culmination of a long history, as you mentioned. No, okay, for Hannah Arendt it's something brand new. That's a very different philosophical perspective on that. By the way, I think I'm not wrong, but Hilberg, among the luminaries of the Holocaust studies, was one of the very few not to criticize her for Eichmann in Jerusalem, or less than others. Okay, so he didn't know at that moment probably that she was responsible for the rejection of his manuscript. When he learned, maybe he would have a different views. Okay, so this would be the novelty of totalitarianism is something brand new. You'll see the film, or you saw the film. There are 2 or 3 films, but in one of the films, when she talks in the where Barbara Sukova plays Hannah Arendt, and she says something brand new emerged in history that nobody had expected, nobody had known what would be, and she does not locate this in 1933. So, number 2 point by Agnes Scheller would be, and I have to publicly confess, Agnes is a dear friend and my mentor. So I do and I pay tribute to her late husband Ferenc Feyer, who was a very dear friend of mine. And they wrote a wonderful essay together about Hannah Arendt and the tradition of the Great Republic, which is basically very, very important. So, what is happening? When did this something brand new come into being? Arguably in 1903, with the formation of the Bolshevik Party. In her vision of in the totalitarian model, the party is the key issue. And now we go into the third, not any type of party, but what she calls an SS ideologue, eine Weltanschauungspartei. A party, an ideologically driven party, a party which is fully committed. Hannah Arendt rejected the term of secular religion. There's a very famous exchange between her and Voegelin on this particular issue, but ideology and terror are clearly linked, and that emerged in 1903 with the split within Russian social democracy and Lenin's intervention in history, which we discussed about Claude Lefort and Castoriadis, who always emphasized that Lenin's intervention in her history basically created the premise for the rise of the totalitarian model. And that happened in 1903, and without such a party, the Bolshevik regime would not have come into being. The party was Lenin's creation. And that's the reason some of us consider 20th century. And I'm sure that in this respect, Hannah Arendt would have been on my side and other people's side by saying that indeed, yes, Hitler committed the worst possible crimes in the 20th century. But he would not have been able to organize this type of terrorist state and so on had it not been for the Bolshevik Revolution and its consequences in the world. So, 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, precisely as we talk right now, 1917, 2017, I think it would be fair to the memory of Hanna Arendt to recognize the third part, I'm saying the novelty of the totalitarian model. Second would be the relationship between ideology, terror, and party, ideology, and terror, and the similarity, and that was the reason for the reactions in the 1950s and later to her book. The similarity, which nowadays is accepted, but believe me, in 2005, I still attended a conference at Potsdam at the Einstein Forum, and I still had many arguments with participants, and I ate EVM as well in 2002, when I proposed the concept of the devil in history, communism, fascism, and some lessons of the 20th century. Look into the reaction to Tim Snyder's book, Bloodlands, and you'll see that still some people have problems to swallow this particular model. It's still unpalatable for some people to say that fundamentally the two, of course I'm not using the identification. Obviously they are not identical. First of all, they were, one came into being before and so on, so they are not identical. But the exterminist intentionality existed in both of them, and they used similar type of institutions in order to attain their goals. That's the point. Okay, so this is the only point I'm trying to make, not more than that. Otherwise, I'm fully aware of the difference between the Führer and the Bosch. Some of us spent quite a lot of time, so it's not a point. So I think she would not have objected to that. But she clearly, and I mentioned in a conversation before, it's the very important moment when she's invited in 1972 by Zbigniew Brzezinski to attend his seminar on communism at Columbia. And she discussed 3 books there. One was Roy Medvedev, Let History Judge, Solzhenitsyn, it's before the Archipelago came out into English. It came out a year after her death. I would have liked to know what she would have said about the Archipelago, but it's the pavilion, Rakovy Corpus, the cancer pavilion, the cancer ward, and Nadezhda Mandelstam, Hope Against Hope. These were the 3 books that she discussed. And basically her conclusion is, why are these books so important? She focused on Nadezhda Mandelstam because she was obsessed with memory, and Nadezhda Mandelstam was basically the goddess of memory, if you want. Okay, so she says, none of the things that I learned reading this book is new to me. What is new is that there were a number of moral individuals who knew them and resisted. So the moral survival is the element that is very, very important in the story. I would like to share with you, I have my own paper, but I think Marius, if he accepts my compliments here, okay, gave a very good presentation on this Zweig Arendt story, so I would rather focus on this general perspective on Arendt. Of course, the fourth element in Heller's reading of Arendt, enduring element, would be the distinction between liberation and liberty. This is fundamental. In my own interpretation, it's not only mine, and as a personal confession, Elena asked me, and other people, how was Hanna Arendt perceived in the Soviet bloc, what used to be the Soviet bloc. Hanna Arendt was immensely popular. You'd say, of course, how could you read it? It circulated. There were all these institutions that were sending books and so on from Paris bookstores and so on. So it circulated, okay, including from copies of the Party Academy copies and so on. So people were copying it and so on. So let me share with you something which I think is very telltale. It came out in the New York Review of Books in the March 8, 2001 issue, and it's based on Elena Boner's speech accepting the 2000 Hanna Arendt Award given jointly by the city of Bremen, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and the Hanna Arendt German Association. Now, I suspect that most of the people know Elena Boner was one of the most important figures of the human rights movement in the Soviet Union, married to Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov, and a hero of the anti-totalitarian struggle. So if I pay tribute to Hannah Arendt, I think it's only fair to pay tribute to somebody like Elena Boner. And I'll quote from Elena Boner at the end of my intervention. I'll say a few words after that about Zweig. Okay, quote from Elena Boner. I was educated in Soviet schools where social studies and courses in the history of the CPSU were mandatory. CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Later, at med school, I studied philosophy, naturally, Marxist-Leninism, and political economy. I did not ask myself whether there was even a grain of truth in them. Once I passed the exams, without which I could not graduate and become a doctor, I forgot everything I had learned. It took many years, says Elena Boner, she passed away a few years ago, to understand that by not studying subjects beyond the official requirements, I had rejected an important, perhaps the fundamental part of human culture, and had become a person without an intelligible view of the world. I'm speaking of myself because I am no exception. Most people in my parents' generation and my own had a similar experience. We lived and grew up in an atmosphere of total fear. This is something that Hanna Arendt captures very well in The Origins and in other. Humiliation, disgrace, and fear are concepts that are extremely important in our analysis of what the totalitarian system makes to the human soul. Okay, so the fate of the human soul under totalitarianism, if you want it to be a great book, I think. Okay, most people in my parents' generation, we lived and grew up in an atmosphere of total fear, often without even realizing it. There were 23 pupils in my class, and 11 had parents who had been arrested. Terror is the true essence of this government, Hanna Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism. This is Elena Boner in Bremen quoting Hanna Arendt. Stalin's death and the fall of totalitarianism did not lead to the disappearance of this fear. It seemed to be part of our genetic structure passed on to subsequent generations. This is why there was never a student movement in the USSR. On the whole, our society remained one without genuine convictions. I'm not speaking of state ideology. We don't have one now, and we don't need one, but of the absence of moral criteria and the ability to distinguish truth from lies, good from evil. In other words, to escape what Hanna Arendt, with the help of her friend Mary McCarthy actually, because used to call thoughtlessness. Okay, they worked a lot for this translation. Mary McCarthy was desperate to turn Hanna's Germanic English into American English. Okay, so there was a lot of editing on that part. And thoughtlessness, they fought about this translation. What would be the right word? So they decided it would be thoughtlessness. Okay, and only a few people like Andrei Sakharov could develop a cosmologically whole and humanistic picture of the world that rejected lies totally. Totalitarian is, to quote Leszek Kołakowski, the lie is the immortal soul of totalitarianism. This is a very famous statement. I think it's Kolakowski's philosophy, and let me pay tribute also to this great humanist. Reading Arendt, writes Elena Boner, is frightening even today. Her account of the general resemblance of the Nazi and communist regimes has been confirmed by many others. On Hitler, he was phenomenally false, lack of sense of reality, indifference to facts, from Konrad Haydn's biography of Hitler. On Stalin, revulsion for the truth of life, indifference to the real situation, quote from Nikita Khrushchev, secret speech. In Germany, the Führer is always right. In the USSR, the party is never wrong. In the GDR, it was even the official anthem of the SED, the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, Die Partei hat immer Recht. Okay, you can find it now with the Mighty Mouse. Anne Applebaum put the link. You know, Mighty Mouse singing the Partei hat immer Recht. Okay, it's a cartoon. Okay, in the USSR, as the song put it, bravely will go to war for the power of the Soviets and will die as one dies in the fight. Death camps in the Gulag. Gas was used in the former. The latter didn't need to waste money on it. Hunger and cold and freeze and frost did the job. Okay, so, however, writes Elena Boner, in Germany some legal court procedures were observed for non-Jews. In our country, people were executed immediately after a 15-minute meeting of a Troika summary court, and sometimes without one. Her uncle, she says, my uncle, was executed on December 20th, 1937, 80 years ago, and his sentence was passed on December 31. So this is what I wanted to bring, because I think the totalitarian model captures the 2 or 3 most important and most disturbing and most catastrophic experiments in creating mandatory happiness in the name of an ideological or a set of guidelines of people who were convinced that they had an infallible epistemological mandate to make humanity better, to purify humanity. There's another element that appears in Arendt's reading of totalitarianism, and which is basically the relationship between the ideal of purification and evil. And I think this needs to be mentioned. Okay, so let me say just a few words and I'm finished. Okay, and then I'll read a little bit from Josh. Okay, because it's, I think, very important. Okay, so Agnes said that Hannah Arendt only once or twice referred to feminine figures in her writings and so on. Rosa Luxemburg, she said. I would take a little bit issue with that. She had an unfaltering admiration for Rahel Varnhagen. The courage to be herself. I'm sure Agnes knew. I mean, simply, was taken by the rhetoric, yes, a little bit. Okay, to remain independent without denying her identity. The essay on Stefan Zweig begins with a description of a dream. I'm sure many people read it, but this is one of the most impressive. So this essay that Marius spoke about, which is about the world of yesterday. Okay, so the essay on Stefan Zweig begins with the description of a dream by Rahel Varnhagen, the famous hostess of one of the great German literary salons of the first half of the 19th century. A dream in which Rahel is in heaven with her close friends, Bettina von Arnim and Caroline von Humboldt. The key word in that dream is disgrace. Disgrace. As Hannah Arendt adds, that the essay is called Stefan Zweig, Jews in the World of Yesterday. That's the title of the essay. And she writes, disgrace and honor are political concepts, categories of public life. So these are public life. Her great objection, as Marius put it, concerning Zweig is precisely the hesitation to define himself as a political subject, foreshadowing not only the origins but also the explosive report on the banality of evil, on which I have a very different view than Agnes Scheller, okay, if I may. Okay, Hannah Arendt deems fleeing from politics a cause of the failure to foresee the disaster that followed. Had the Jews of Western and Central Europe countries displayed even a modicum of concern for the political realities of their times, they would have had reason not to feel secure. In this regard, although he was a citizen of the world, Weltbürger, or perhaps even because of it, one can safely assume that there is no better document of the Jewish situation in this period than the opening chapters of Zweig's book. This is from Arendt, so she speaks with admiration. At the end of this disturbing essay, Arendt quotes from one of Zweig's last articles. Once more, the writer puts himself forward as an example of European consciousness, that of a Europe torn, mutilated, maimed, beschädigt. Okay, so what is the subtitle of Minima Moralia? Okay, so this is okay. So, but argue strongly that yesterday cannot be separated from today, as if a man had been hurled down from a great height as a result of a violent blow. This is the way in which Zweig came to discover and especially embrace that same Jewishness which Hannah Arendt considered a matter of course, a factual truth, quote. Since he had wanted all his life to live in peace with the political and social standards of his time, he was unable to fight against a world in whose eyes it was and it is a disgrace to be a Jew. For honor never will be won by the cult of success or fame, by the cultivation of one's own self, nor even by personal dignity. From the, quotation marks, disgrace of being a Jew, there is only one escape: to fight for the honor of the Jewish people as a whole. And controversial at my end could be, I think I can argue in favor of my statement, this is the main reason why Hannah Arendt never hesitated to criticize things that she believed objectionable, yet without ever, bold, ever, calling into question, after 1948, the non-negotiable right to existence of the State of Israel. 1967, she was very clear on that, and during the war. Very clear, with no equivocation and no ambiguity. Okay? Because she saw in the State of Israel the only chance for the Jewish people to enter into a genuine, modern political contract, to quote from her words. So, this was my introduction. Thank you. Yes, it's going to be very short, just the introduction, the conclusions are directly linked to what we discussed. So George Cherniss, Assistant Professor of Political Science, Georgetown University, Harvard PhD, author of a wonderful book, The Political Thought of Isaiah Berlin. So when we put together, Marius was the put together the panel. When we discussed the panel, I said we need ein Berliner into this story. Some of you may know it's one of the nicest anecdotes, but it's based on reality. I know it from Josh, so let me start with the anecdote. At a certain moment, Isaiah Berlin was asked what he thought about Hannah Arendt. And his answer was that she's the most overrated political philosopher of our times. Mary McCarthy found out about this statement, so Isaiah Berlin visits New York. And Mary McCarthy, in one of the New York salons, go to Isaiah Berlin and says, Sir Isaiah, you said that my friend Hannah Arendt is the most overrated political thinker of our times. And Berlin said, yes, I did. He said, but she also thinks that you are the most overrated political thinker of our times. And Sir Isaiah was a superb conversationalist and had a great sense of humor. He said, Mary, something, I think we are both right. That's real. It happened. Okay, so I know it from Josh. It's a great, great story. It was both of them responding this way. They didn't like each other. Okay, so from Josh Cherniss. So here's a book which is called The Political Thought of Isaiah Berlin that came out from Oxford University Press. So he's a Berliner, as they say, so he comes from Isaiah Berlin's perspective. In A Fly Attacking an Elephant, Stefan Zweig's defense of a liberal ethos and a lost Europe. In this paper, Cherniss writes, I take issue somewhat impertinently, perhaps with Hannah Arendt, suggesting that her characteristically severe verdict on Stefan Zweig's response to totalitarianism was not entirely just. But I nevertheless do want to begin with Arendt's adverse judgment, in particular her framing of Zweig's life and fate in terms of ethically laden categories of honor and disgrace, which Arendt suggests are central for both political life and the curious and tragic conditions of Jews in modern Europe. Arendt stresses that honor and disgrace are political concepts, and those outside of politics can know nothing of them. For Arendt, Zweig's embrace of a cosmopolitan European identity reflected a flight from the disgrace and insecurity of his Jewishness, which prevented him from confronting the particularly Jewish fate which was his own. I'll skip the quotation. Against the charges of political evasion and of having no sense of what honor can mean to man, Cherniss argues that Zweig's biographies of Erasmus, Sebastian Castellio, and Montaigne, which was his major project at the end of his life, written between 1934 and 1942, he was working on the biography of Montaigne at the moment he committed suicide, represent an oblique political project as well as an attempt to defend his honor. The project had three phases. To evoke a transnational European identity defined by commitment to liberal ideas and the liberal spirit, one. Two, to depict the nobility and wisdom, but also the vulnerabilities and limitations of the liberal spirit. And three, to evoke an ideal of inner freedom and suggest how individuals might safeguard this freedom. He meaning Zweig, thereby hoped to contribute to preserving this ideal, spirit and identity through a time when they were under attack. So that this lost treasure, to appropriate an Arendtian formulation, might be preserved for later generation. Bottles thrown into the ocean. Maybe one day somebody would, to use Benjamin's image. Okay. Zweig's ways of pursuing this project was characteristic. Now known mostly for his short stories and novellas, Zweig was a prolific author of biographical studies. He found it most natural to explore his ideas through portraits of others, rather than more abstractly and directly. Cherniss's title comes from a self-deprecating note that Sébastien Castellio wrote in the margin of his reply to Jean Calvin, which was The Fight. It's a very famous book by Zweig, with which Zweig began his study of Castellio. Zweig saw himself as engaged in some perilous journey against fanatical dogmatism and dictatorship as his humanist heroes. For Zweig, Erasmus, Castellio, and Montaigne represented the same humane, tolerant, cosmopolitan, skeptical, scrupulous spirit, but each also allowed Zweig to illuminate different facets of or variation on this spirit. And now the conclusion. I'm not going to go into the three characters, which are fascinating. Zweig's turn into biography and his choice of subjects reflected a larger view of history and politics. Stefan Zweig tended to view matters from the perspective of the individual, even as he doubted the individual's ability to shape history. Firmly committed to liberal humanistic ideals, he saw politics as essentially amoral or immoral. As a matter of fact, I read many times The World of Yesterday, and he says that never ever was he interested in meeting political leaders. The only time, he says, that he dealt with a political leader was when he wrote a letter to Benito Mussolini, who was one of his great admirers as a writer, to intervene for a political prisoner in Italy. But he never met Mussolini. So basically he said, I refused to become Feuchtwanger and Bernard Shaw and so on, visiting the dictators of this world. Okay, so yet Zweig maintained that no effort made by the pure at heart should be deemed futile and stigmatized as barren, nor is any expenditure of moral energy dissipated in empty space to leave no repercussions. Those who suffer and are defeated in their own time can provide an example and articulate values that triumph later. So, this brings us back to the place of the Jews in Zweig's imagination of European humanism. For Zweig, the Jews were homeless and thus universal people. He even quoted Nietzsche on that, okay? Who transcended narrow nationalism. Forced repeatedly to flee and to rely on themselves, they by necessity cultivated their independence, that freedom from external commitments. Withstanding defeat after defeat, they preserved the spiritual wealth intact and transmitted it across generations. This spiritual resilience was linked in Zweig's mind to the importance of avoiding emulation of anti-liberal fanatical politics. In November 1933, Zweig expressed the hope that the younger generation of German Jews would rise superior to the present in strength and ethical feeling, growing up to be not a hating people of vengeance, but a people of understanding, carrying out our historical mission as mediator between all nations. He returned to this theme the next year. If Jewry had been able through thousands of years to resist oppression and attack, it is because even in the time of danger, Jews gave the best they could. The liberal ethos that Zweig presented in Erasmus, Castellio, and Montaigne has its failures. Zweig himself, for reasons partly related to his conception of politics, partly to his character, often fell prey to these vulnerabilities. He was sharply aware of this. In moments of doubt, he expressed the fear that he and his peers had been poisoned by humanism, quote his words, poisoned by humanism, rendering them impotent against fanaticism. Nevertheless, in his own modest, gentle, sometimes oblique way, he remained true to its deepest political, ethical imperatives. In the words of a later, temperamentally tougher proponent of this spirit, to refuse to become a partisan and to practice, as best one can, the politics of damage control, of doing as little harm as possible, Zweig's refusal, like his heroes Montaigne's, is not heroic in the martial sense, but it is ethically less coward than a surrender to fanaticism and cynicism. Conclude last paragraph. Zweig's own struggle, honorable or not, ended in a defeat, in death. Was his choice of death an act of cowardice, as both Hannah Arendt and Thomas Mann put it in these words? Okay? Or flight from a seemingly losing battle that he no longer had the strength to endure? Was an act of defiance, a demonstration that if he could not do nothing to preserve the liberal, cosmopolitan, genteel and gentle world that he loved, he would at least refuse to be part of the brutal world that seemed destined to succeed. Or was it simply the understandable reaction of a lifelong depressive, worn out by the constant care and repeated flights, who saw, quote, to quit the scene quietly and with dignity as the least bad option open to him? Any of this interpretation may be valid. We are free to interpret his act as we may, though, given what we know about the weight of history and the ambiguity of the human heart, we should be slow to judge. We may at least, beyond any before judging, spare some compassion for this cultivated man in his hour of despair, mourning a lost and a better world, embracing his memories, his ideals, and his wife, in the last throes of a death that was more than, at the same time, irreducibly and privately his own. That's the end of Josh's presentation. Thank you.